On February 24th, 2017, 28-year-old Shannon Graves sat on the couch watching TV with her boyfriend in her apartment in Youngstown, Ohio. Shannon changed the channel, and right away she could see that her boyfriend, who was a man in his early 30s named Arturo Novoa, looked annoyed by what she wanted to watch, so she flipped the channel to something else. Then Shannon glanced over at Arturo, but he still looked annoyed. Shannon sighed, trying her best to keep her cool. It was not that long ago that sitting on the couch with Arturo would have made for a relaxing evening at home. But now, every time the two were around each other, they just seemed to argue about everything, even meaningless stuff like what to watch on TV. Shannon put the remote down and then leaned back on the couch and didn't say anything. She hoped that maybe if she just sat there in silence, they could avoid a fight. But in reality, Shannon knew that this TV show she chose, or whatever little thing they ended up arguing about next, was actually just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Her and Arturo's relationship was clearly falling apart. The two of them met almost a year earlier at the club where Shannon had been working nights as a dancer while she went to classes during the day to earn her cosmetology degree. And despite their obvious differences, at first they had gotten along great. Shannon was outgoing and always seemed to be on the move, while Arturo was quiet and more reserved. But they thought their differences actually complemented each other really well. So, after dating for only a few months, Shannon and Arturo moved into an apartment together. And that's when things started to go bad. It was like right away, they just both stopped trusting each other. Arturo accused Shannon of still being into her ex-boyfriend, a guy she'd actually been living with before she met Arturo, and Shannon was convinced that Arturo had a thing for this woman who was always hanging around him when he would come to see Shannon at the club. But whether or not those things were true, Shannon knew her issues with the relationship ran deeper than just thinking Arturo might like some other girl. Shannon had always been someone who loved change. She just never wanted to feel stuck. And so to avoid that feeling, she would often do things like dye her long black hair green and blue, or she'd take much bigger steps like she would occasionally just leave town for weeks at a time to go on an adventure by herself without telling anyone where she was. But living with Arturo had definitely made Shannon feel stuck. And over the last few months, that feeling had really worn her down. Back in the apartment, Shannon eventually just stood up from the couch and began to walk out of the room. But as she did, Arturo snapped at her for some reason, and then before long, the two of them were just yelling at each other. And the argument escalated, even though neither of them really knew what they were even fighting about. Until finally, Arturo said, maybe he should just leave for good. And then he stormed out. Shannon stood there in her apartment for a minute, trying to catch her breath and calm down. She was mad, but she also couldn't help but feel this sense of relief. If Arturo was gone, like really gone, she could now do anything she wanted. She could make a change. She could go someplace new. A few months earlier, Shannon had finally earned her cosmetology degree. She had worked really hard for it, and she was proud of herself. Some people had been surprised because they thought getting a degree sort of went against Shannon's need for constant change, but Shannon saw things differently. Her degree could open doors and give her a chance to work as a cosmetologist in different cities. Or maybe she could even become a highly sought-after makeup artist who would get to travel all over the world. But Arturo had never really supported her dreams, so she had kind of given up on them. Now, she could start putting her degree and her talents to work, and she would not have to do that in Youngstown, Ohio. And just thinking about the possibilities for the future got her really excited. Shannon walked to the bathroom, got undressed, and turned on the shower. In her mind, she would wash off all the bad stuff that had happened recently, and it would be like the first small step towards a fresh start. On June 22, 2017, so 4 months after Shannon and Arturo had their big fight, Detective Mike Lambert of the Youngstown Police Department looked up from his desk, and he saw a uniformed police officer standing there with a woman who looked very pale and worried. Detective Lambert asked how he could help. The woman said her name was Debbie DePaul, and she needed to file a missing persons report. She said that nobody had seen or talked to her younger half-sister, Shannon Graves, in 4 months. A confused look came across Lambert's face, and for a second he thought he must have misheard her. And so he asked her again, how long has it been since anybody talked to your half-sister? and Debbie repeated herself and said again it had been 4 months. This blew Lambert away. In all his time as a detective, he'd seen family and friends typically file missing persons report, if anything, too soon, like before they really needed to, not 4 months after the fact. In fact, in the majority of cases he'd worked, the supposed missing person had turned up before the cops could even launch a real search. So he really couldn't understand why Debbie, or anyone else close to Shannon, had waited this long to talk to the police. Lambert told the other officer he could leave, and he asked Debbie to take a seat and walk him through what was going on here. After the officer left, Debbie sat down and said she knew how strange it must sound that she had waited this long. But if Lambert knew her sister Shannon, it would make way more sense. She said that Shannon had a history of just sort of taking off and not talking to anyone for long periods of time. It was something she'd done since she was a teenager. And as difficult as it was to deal with that, Shannon's friends and family had sort of come to accept it about her. It was one of the things that made Shannon who she was. But now, they noticed that Shannon had not called on a couple of family birthdays, and she also hadn't checked in when her best friend had a baby, and that was not like Shannon at all. Even when she went away without telling anyone, she would always call on these important days. Detective Lambert didn't say this, but he knew 4 months might as well have been an eternity when it came to a missing persons case. If Shannon had really left town, like her sister claimed she liked to do, well, Shannon could be anywhere in the world by now. But Lambert figured he would just start his investigation the same way he would if Shannon had only been missing for a few days. So he took down information about Shannon's physical appearance, her last known address, and the places she had worked. He also learned small details like Shannon's favorite color was pink, and she loved wearing friendship bracelets. And so after only speaking to Debbie for a few minutes, Detective Lambert had a pretty good picture of who Shannon was. But he had one more question. He asked Debbie if Shannon had a romantic partner. Debbie said yes, Shannon had a boyfriend, or at least she did the last time they had spoken. She had been living with a guy named Arturo Novoa, and Shannon had told Debbie that she and Arturo fought all the time. The following day, Detective Lambert sat down with Arturo in a small interview room at the station. Lambert had looked into Arturo the night before. He knew Arturo had a couple of minor run-ins with the police, but nothing big, and he had no record of violent crimes or anything like that. So Lambert really just hoped that Arturo knew where Shannon was, or at least had heard from her over the past 4 months, and also, if he hadn't, he hoped to get a good idea of what Arturo and Shannon's relationship had been like. But when Lambert asked Arturo when he'd last seen or talked to Shannon, Arturo seemed surprised by the question. He said he'd already told all this to Shannon's family when they'd called him like a month or so earlier. He said he and Shannon had broken up back in February. He admitted that things ended pretty badly, so they had not spoken to each other since. The last he'd heard, Shannon was living with some guy in Cleveland, which was over an hour away from Youngstown. Arturo didn't know the name of the man that Shannon was supposedly living with, so he really couldn't provide much more color than he already had. And so Lambert wrapped up their conversation soon after that, and then he reached out to Shannon's sister, Debbie, to see if she knew of any men, other than Arturo, that Shannon could possibly be with. Debbie said before Shannon had started dating Arturo, she'd been in a serious relationship with a man named John Scarata. Just hearing that name shocked Lambert, and it caused him to immediately begin planning his next move, because he knew John Scarata all too well. John had a substantial criminal history. In fact, he had done time in prison on drug charges, and Lambert knew that John had gotten out of prison right around the last time anyone had seen Shannon. After speaking to Debbie, Detective Lambert got to work right away tracking down John, and it would turn out he was not in Cleveland. He was in Youngstown, trying to get his life together after getting out of prison. The following day, when John Scarata walked into the interview room at the station, he greeted Detective Lambert like they were old friends. And when the detective brought up Shannon, John didn't seem surprised at all. He said he'd learned Shannon had disappeared not long after he'd gotten out of prison. So Lambert asked if he was worried about her. And John, in response to this, did something that Lambert did not see coming at all. John leaned forward in his chair and said yes, he was really worried. In fact, he was so worried, he'd started his own investigation. Lambert was so caught off guard by this that he didn't really know how to react. What did John mean he was doing his own investigation? But just then, John grabbed his phone out of his pocket, pulled up his photos, and showed them to Lambert. And Lambert saw multiple pictures of different cars that had been parked right outside of Shannon's apartment over the past few months. John had staked out the place, looking for Shannon or for anything or anyone that seemed out of the ordinary. Lambert felt a little conflicted. He believed if something bad had happened to Shannon, John had to be a major suspect here. But he couldn't deny that he did want to track down all of these cars John had photographed at Shannon's apartment. So ultimately, Lambert did get the license plate numbers of all the cars, and he told John to stop staking out Shannon's place and to just let the police do their jobs. John said he totally understood. He just wanted to find Shannon and make sure she was okay. Detective Lambert knew John had connections to the criminal world of Youngstown, Ohio, so there really was a chance that John thought he was the best person to find Shannon, a woman he claimed to still be in love with. But there was also a chance that John was just trying to send the police on some kind of wild goose chase to keep them off of his trail, because maybe he had something to do with what happened to Shannon. So, in the days following their meeting, Lambert and his team tried to get a clear picture of everywhere John had been since he'd gotten out of prison, and if he'd had any communication with Shannon near the time she'd supposedly disappeared. Police also questioned Shannon's friends, her family, and her coworkers at the nightclub, and they also followed up on all those cars John had photographed. But for Shannon's half-sister Debbie, the police were not moving fast enough. She now believed that she and her family had waited way too long to get the cops involved, and so she felt like she had to do something to make up for that. So, in late June, about a week after she had filed the missing persons report, Debbie knocked on the door of a house in Youngstown that looked pretty much like all the other houses around it, except for the sign in the window that advertised psychic readings. A woman with a soft smile opened the door and led Debbie down a hallway to a small dark room. The woman told Debbie she was a psychic medium, which meant she claimed to be able to communicate with spirits or the deceased, and then was able to relay their messages to the living. Debbie sat down at a table with the medium and described Shannon and talked about how she'd been missing for months. The medium closed her eyes and listened carefully, and after a moment, she told Debbie she could see something: a bridge. Now, this medium didn't know exactly which bridge this was, but she was sure it was not far away from here. And somehow, this bridge had to be connected to Shannon's disappearance. Debbie left the medium's house and immediately called a friend of hers and told her what the medium had said. And both women decided it was clear what they had to do next. They would have to search every bridge in Youngstown, Ohio. And so for the next couple of weeks, Debbie and her friend went around town visiting every bridge they could find. And it started to feel like a waste of time. That is, until one afternoon when Debbie and her friend approached a small bridge that neither of them had driven on before. As they stepped out of the car, they saw something laying on the ground near the base of one of the bridge's girders. When Debbie walked over to it and knelt down to get a better look, she almost started crying. Because there, laying on the ground, were saw blades, a rope, and a pink sock. Debbie and her friend took pictures of the objects and then drove straight to the police station. Debbie told Detective Lambert about the medium's vision and showed him the photos of what they'd found at the bridge. Lambert had learned from Debbie when they first met that Shannon's favorite color was pink, and that she loved wearing pink clothes. He couldn't just ignore saw blades and a rope being found out in the middle of nowhere next to a pink sock. So, the detective told Debbie that he and his team would look into it right away. But as Lambert headed out to this bridge, he started to feel like this case was getting away from him. He was already dealing with the missing woman's ex-boyfriend conducting his own investigation, and now he was following up on a lead that apparently came from a psychic medium. And Lambert still had no idea what had happened to Shannon. She really could just be in Cleveland or anywhere else, purposefully avoiding her friends and family. Or she could be the victim of a horrible crime. One way or the other, Lambert needed some piece of concrete evidence to point him in the right direction. And while he didn't want to rule anything out, he doubted that that piece of evidence was going to come from a psychic vision. About a month later, on the afternoon of July 29th, a woman was making Italian food at her house in a small town just a few miles from Youngstown. As she cooked, she looked down at the food she was making, and suddenly she got mad at herself. She realized she didn't have enough meat to make the meatballs she was planning to serve with this meal. She thought about taking a quick trip to the grocery store, but then she remembered something. So she called out to her husband in the next room and told him to keep an eye on the stove. She left the kitchen and walked down a set of old wooden steps into the basement. She passed by their washer and dryer and walked over to a white, rectangle-shaped chest freezer that was standing up against the wall. Now, this woman knew there was meat inside this freezer, and she could use it to make her meatballs. But there was a problem. The freezer had a padlock on it. But the woman was undeterred. She grabbed a nearby screwdriver off a work table and used it to pry the entire metal latch that the lock was connected to off the freezer. And so now, with the freezer unlocked, the woman opened it up, and immediately she began to scream. At about 5:30 that afternoon, 2 hours after that woman had looked inside the freezer, crime scene investigator Tony Marzullo walked down the stairs into the married couple's basement. Marzullo worked out of Youngstown, but he helped in the surrounding smaller towns when he was needed. And today, he'd gotten one of the strangest calls he'd ever received from police dispatch in one of those smaller towns. Marzullo put on his gloves and approached the freezer. The freezer door was still open, and he could see inside of the freezer was an orange plastic bucket with trash bags sticking out of it. Marzullo got closer and leaned over the freezer and looked inside of that bucket. And the instant he did, he reflexively put his hand over his mouth and tried to collect himself. Even the call from dispatch had not prepared him for this. Because in the bucket, Marzullo was looking at the top half of a frozen, severed human head. Marzullo looked down deeper into the freezer, and he saw the entire thing was basically filled with trash bags. And as he pulled out each of these bags and looked inside of them, he found human legs, human arms, and human hands. Marzullo had no idea who the victim was, but instinctively, he grabbed his phone and called Detective Lambert. Later that evening, Detective Lambert stood in the basement with Marzullo and a group of police officers and forensic technicians. Like Lambert had expected, the psychic vision and the objects found at that bridge had not given him any new leads in Shannon's case, and neither had any of the interviews Lambert had conducted to this point. Basically, the case had stalled. He had no idea where Shannon was or what happened to her. But now, as he stood over the freezer, he had a sinking feeling that the body he was looking at could be hers. Now, they would need to run some tests to officially identify the body, but Marzullo was very confident they could do that quickly. Forensic techs would allow the severed hands they'd found to defrost. Then they would use a saline solution to rehydrate the fingers on those hands, which would allow them to pull clean fingerprints. While Lambert waited for those results, he interviewed the married couple who lived at the house to try to figure out how a dismembered body had wound up in their basement. The couple proved to be extremely cooperative. They said that freezer was not theirs. A friend had asked to store it in their house because the electricity in his house had been cut off, and he didn't want the meat in the freezer to go bad. When their friend had brought it over, they did think it was odd that the freezer had a padlock on it, but they'd assumed the freezer door just didn't stay shut on its own, so their friend must have locked it just to make sure the meat inside stayed frozen. The woman went on to tell Lambert that the only reason she had broken into the freezer is because she really wanted to make meatballs. Lambert thought the story was definitely strange, but none of it sounded untrue. So he asked who was this friend who gave them the freezer. They said his name was Anthony Gonzalez, but he was trying to become a hip-hop star, so sometimes he went by the name Tony G. That night, Lambert began his search for Anthony Gonzalez, aka Tony G. But despite it seeming like a pretty common name, he could not find a single Anthony Gonzalez living in Youngstown. And before Lambert could expand his search for Anthony to nearby towns, he got a call from Marzullo. Marzullo told him the lab had successfully pulled fingerprints from the now defrosted hands they'd found, and they were able to officially identify the victim. The body in the freezer was Shannon Graves. Now that police had finally found Shannon's body, and this had become a homicide investigation, news of the grisly discovery in the basement spread across Youngstown. And in the days following the discovery, Detective Lambert got an unexpected visitor at the station. Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, had returned. John had heard about Shannon's body, and he admitted right off the bat to Detective Lambert that despite what he'd promised him, he said he had not actually given up his own investigation into Shannon's case. And in fact, now he had discovered something huge. John heard from a friend of his about a house party that had taken place a few months earlier. And at this house party, a man named Andrew Herman had been burning some of Shannon's stuff in a huge bonfire. With help from John, Detective Lambert and several other investigators found their way to the house where this party had taken place. And as soon as they got out of their cars, they could see the remnants of a bonfire in the front yard. There was a big pit filled with ashes and big pieces of wood around it that looked like they'd been used for seating. Lambert and a crime scene investigator walked across the dying grass in the front yard. They put on their gloves and began sifting through the large pile of ashes. And they found what looked like charred clothing and some burned pieces of plastic. But to their utter shock, it looked like one object had survived the fire and remained almost perfectly preserved. And as Lambert bent down and pulled this object out of the ashes, he almost couldn't believe it. Because of all the possible things he could have found, this was like the perfect clue. The object was a friendship bracelet with small plastic beads strung on it that spelled out Shannon. There was no doubt that John had been right. Somebody had been burning Shannon's things. Investigators headed back to the station with this new piece of evidence, and Lambert set up a meeting with Andrew Herman, the man John said had been burning Shannon's things. But John warned Lambert to watch out, because Andrew was a total psychopath. A guy who was into black magic and who worshipped the serial killer cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. On August 7th, 2017, so about a week and a half after the discovery of Shannon's body, Detective Lambert led Andrew into an interview room. And Lambert had to admit that Andrew was not anything like what he'd expected. Andrew wore a well-fitted suit and tie, and his hair was short and neatly combed. He looked way more like a guy who worked at a bank than somebody who was into black magic and serial killers. But Lambert knew the way this guy was dressing didn't prove anything one way or another. Detective Lambert told Andrew right away that they had gone to the site of the house party and discovered a friendship bracelet inside of a fire pit that they were sure belonged to Shannon Graves, and that they'd heard Andrew was the one trying to burn it. Andrew nodded and said, yep, the bracelet was Shannon's, and he was trying to burn it. And he also admitted that he and a couple other people had also burned some of Shannon's other things at that party. Lambert just looked at him and said it seemed very suspicious that they had burned the belongings of a woman who'd recently been found brutally murdered. But Andrew did not flinch. In a perfectly calm voice, he said they had burned the stuff as a favor for a friend, Anthony Gonzalez. Now, Detective Lambert did not react to what he was hearing, but inside, after hearing that name, he felt like he was about to lock up this investigation. Because he was now able to connect Anthony, aka Tony G, the man who'd brought the freezer to the married couple's basement, directly to the bonfire that had been used to get rid of Shannon's personal belongings. So Lambert asked why his friend, Anthony, had wanted to burn Shannon's stuff in the first place. Andrew sat there in silence for a minute, and then he began to speak. And when he did, without ever losing his cool, he told a story that was even gorier and more disturbing than any story Detective Lambert had ever heard in his life. And by the time Andrew stopped telling this story, Lambert knew exactly what had happened to Shannon Graves. Based on information from Andrew, evidence found in the basement freezer, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Shannon on February 24, 2017, and the following days. The killer walked through Shannon's apartment, breathing heavily and clutching a hammer in their hand. They could hear the shower running, so they headed for the bathroom. Once there, they opened the door and stepped inside. Shannon shouted something and pulled back the shower curtain, but before she could even figure out what was happening, the killer raised the hammer and slammed it into the top of her head. Shannon's body collapsed in the shower, and blood began to run into the drain. As for the killer, they continued to swing the hammer over and over again into Shannon's head. Her body twitched and then eventually stopped moving. She was dead in the shower. The killer turned off the water and just stood there for a second, staring down at what they'd done. And for the first time, they realized that killing Shannon was actually just the beginning. Now they had to get rid of her body. The killer rushed to the kitchen, found trash bags, and came right back. They opened up a bathroom cabinet, grabbed an electric razor, and turned it on. Then they leaned into the shower and shaved Shannon's head, believing this would help disguise her identity. When they were finished, the killer put the razor back, opened one of the trash bags, and awkwardly pulled Shannon's body out of the shower onto the bathroom floor. They tried to stuff Shannon into the trash bag, but quickly realized that was never going to work. So they tried to wrap the trash bag around her, but that failed too. The bag just wasn't big enough. The killer started to panic. They knew they had not thought this through. So they grabbed their phone and called their girlfriend. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The killer opened it and quickly led their girlfriend into the bathroom and showed her Shannon's body. The girlfriend did her best to stay calm. She said after dark, they could move Shannon's body to her place and figure out what to do with it from there. So the killer and their girlfriend spent a couple of hours in Shannon's apartment just kind of waiting around with Shannon's dead body only a few feet away. Not long after sunset, the killer and the girlfriend grabbed Shannon's clothes off the bathroom floor, they took her purse, and then did their best to wrap Shannon's body up in trash bags. Then they carried her body and her belongings out into the darkness and put everything into the trunk of the girlfriend's car. They drove to the girlfriend's house and brought Shannon's body inside and laid it in the bathtub. Then the killer called the one friend they thought could help. And later that night, that friend arrived with a fully formed plan and a machete. The killer, the girlfriend, and the friend of the killer spent the entire night dismembering Shannon's body. At some point, the friend told the killer to order sulfuric acid online and to set up a delivery at a bulk store nearby. In the meantime, the friend gathered up all of Shannon's stuff the group had in their possession and went to a house party, where they knew there was going to be a big bonfire, and they burned everything. Not long after that, the sulfuric acid arrived at the bulk store. Killer picked it up, and the three of them covered the now dismembered body parts in the sulfuric acid, hoping to melt Shannon's skin down to the bone. But they soon discovered a problem. In an effort to save money, the killer had bought off-brand sulfuric acid, and it just was not doing the trick. Large parts of Shannon's body were disintegrating in the acid, but not all of it was. So the friend took the machete and started hacking away even more at Shannon's body, while the killer went out and bought a chest freezer. And eventually, the three of them were able to get Shannon's body parts into trash bags and a bucket, and they crammed all of that into the freezer and locked it. And at that point, the killer's friend, who made a point of studying serial killers, believed they had completely covered their tracks. Andrew Herman, the man who supposedly worshipped Jeffrey Dahmer, oversaw the disposal of Shannon's body and her belongings. And his friend, Anthony Gonzalez, who also went by his hip-hop name Tony G, murdered Shannon. But it would turn out Anthony Gonzalez and Tony G, those two names, were both aliases. Anthony, aka Tony G, was actually Shannon's boyfriend, Arturo Novoa. On the night that he and Shannon had fought and he stormed out, Arturo did not leave for good. Instead, he came back, grabbed a hammer, and killed Shannon. But Arturo had not thought the murder through. So after it was done, he called his other girlfriend, the woman who Shannon had seen him hanging around with at the nightclub, for help. This girlfriend, who knew Arturo by his alias, Anthony Gonzalez, was very devoted to him. and was willing to do whatever it took to protect him, which is why she was willing to help dispose of Shannon's body. Police had considered Arturo a suspect, and when they interviewed him after the missing persons report was filed, Arturo worried they would start closing in. So he had taken the freezer with Shannon's body in it to the house of a married couple he knew. He told them he had no electricity at his place and asked them to store the freezer so the meat wouldn't go bad, and they agreed. After the discovery of Shannon's body in their basement, police had begun to look for Anthony Gonzalez, which the married couple believed was their friend's real name who owned the freezer. But it was when the couple showed the police a picture of Anthony that the police knew they were onto something, because they could tell the photo was not of Anthony. The photo was of Arturo. And finally, Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, who had his own investigation, helped Detective Lambert solidify his case. When John led Lambert to the remnants of the bonfire and Shannon's friendship bracelet, it allowed Lambert to bring in Andrew for questioning, because that's who John said was burning all the stuff. And Andrew, when he was interviewed, just told Detective Lambert all about the horrors that had taken place from the moment Arturo killed Shannon until the moment the freezer ended up in the married couple's basement. Arturo was ultimately sentenced to 48 years to life in prison. His girlfriend was sentenced to 18 years for her role in the crime, and Andrew was sentenced to 12 years. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 2010, an avid caver named Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. He arrived in country, he got a rental car, and he hired a guide to take him out to the area where he knew this cave was going to be. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook where he had taken notes the last time he was here, and he used that to find the opening to the cave. He paid the guide to stick around at the car while he went down and explored this cave. He assured him it was not going to be for a very long time. The shaft was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. The visibility inside of the shaft was limited because all you had was the light that was coming in, and because of how narrow the opening was, Jeff's body would obscure a lot of the sunlight coming in. So once Jeff got a few meters down into the tunnel, he would rely on his headlamp. So Jeff enters the cave and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark. So that's where the tunnel goes from being on an angle to being straight. And he's about to make that final descent down that final 30 meters when he notices something out of the corner of his eye. And he focuses his light on the side of the shaft and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering all over the walls. And he looks around him and he realizes from his position down on the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. As much as Jeff wanted to stop right there and go right back up to the surface, he couldn't. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear, and his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. And so he would have to descend the final 30 meters to the bottom, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath, and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. And periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. He saw them on the rope, he's trying to brush them off. He finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off, and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up and he begins making his way back up, and the whole time he's just brushing spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off to get all the spiders off of his clothing. He takes his bag, dumps it out, more spiders are in there. After he finally brushes all the spiders off, he redresses and gets in the car. And you can only imagine what the guide was thinking as he's watching this guy, this foreigner, taking his clothes off after being in this cave. But luckily, he doesn't get bit. He gets in the car with the guide, and they start heading back towards the city. As they're driving, he takes his notebook out, and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. He scratches that out, and on top of it, he writes, "The Entrance to Hell." In 2006, a 14-year-old boy named Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. This was not a typical farm with animals and crops. It was a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and Evan and his family made their living baling pine straw every year. As such, their main living house on the farm was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined up pine trees. They did not have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one road that led into the property, which from the main house, they could look out and basically see through the rows of trees all the way to the beginning of this road, which meant any visitors were really easy to spot. The main house was built on a very slight hill, which meant one side of the house was effectively built on stilts to compensate for the angle. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. So anyone who was in the living room looking out the window, they'd basically need to look at a downward angle to see the ground. It would actually seem like you were on the second floor, but really you're on the first floor. The window in the living room was very unique. It stretched almost the entire length of the room, so almost 50 feet across. And at night, you could see animals darting between the different trees because you could see down the rows. And so that was pretty creepy. And then just the fact that this window is so big, if you're in the living room at night, you just felt really exposed. So between the creepy animals running around and the level of exposure and vulnerability, people basically avoided the living room anytime they were in the house at night. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with him on his farm, and because the main house did not have any extra bedrooms, Evan and his cousin would have to sleep in the living room. There were two couches inside of the living room, one that was right underneath the 50-foot long window, and then another which was on the other side of the room against a wall that did not have a window. And so Evan would be sleeping on the couch right under the window, and his cousin would be sleeping on the other couch. The first night Evan's cousin was there, they put this big sheet up over the window, but it only blocked like 75% of the window. The two flanks of the window were still exposed, but where the couches were lined up, they were kind of blocked by this sheet, so it gave them a little bit of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the boys finally fell asleep around midnight, and then they woke up a couple hours later because they heard Evan's dogs barking way off in the pine trees. Now, Evan was used to his dogs running around the property and barking at other smaller animals, and so just them barking was not necessarily a red flag. But the barking persisted to the point where Evan's cousin got up off the couch, moved across the room to the opening of the window that was not covered by the sheet at the foot of where Evan was sleeping. Now, Evan was still laying on the couch. He was not going to get up and look out the window, so he's looking down at his cousin, kind of looking at his face to get some sort of a read on what he's seeing. And he notices his cousin has this really perplexed look on his face, like he's squinting his eyes and trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And so Evan looks at him and says, "Hey, what's going on? What do you see?" And his cousin's like, "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At this, Evan jumps off the couch and runs over and butts up right next to his cousin so he can look out the window too. And he's scanning out amongst the rows of trees because there's just a mile of pine trees. And the first thing he notices is the moon is very bright that night. So there's good illumination, and there was a light snow covering on the ground, which really added to the illumination. He's looking out maybe 100 meters when he sees someone's leg extend from behind one of the pine trees as if they're stepping into the space between a pine tree column. And he's staring at it, and he can't believe he's even seeing anyone walking around this area because he didn't see anybody come in on the road, and they have no neighbors. And so he's looking, and then a body follows the leg. A person walks from one row to the next. This tall, dark figure just walks calm as can be between the two pine trees. And Evan just grabs his cousin, and he's like, "Did you just see that?" And his cousin's like, "Yeah, I saw that." And so they continue to look in the direction of where this person crossed the path. And after a couple of minutes, they see another leg now emerging, going the other way, back towards where that first person had come from. So the leg kind of extends into this gap, and then this tall figure walks across into the next row, except now, instead of going just directly across, it looks like they're moving at an angle closer to the main house property. The boys look at each other and they don't know what to do, so they just keep looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they're looking, they see this person emerge again, except now they're not 100 meters away, they're like 20 meters away. They don't know how they were able to move that quickly without being seen. And this time when the leg comes out from behind the pine tree, instead of walking across the gap, it stops right in the middle, and it turns and it looks directly at the boys in the window and then begins running toward them. The boys practically fall over trying to get away from the window. Evan's yelling for his father upstairs, and the boys instinctively just start running around the house, locking every door, shutting every window. And as they're going from door to door, the anxiety is growing and growing because they think, if I don't get there fast enough, this person who is running towards the property is going to come barging through that door. And so at every door, their anxiety is through the roof, but they manage to shut everything. Everything is locked right as Evan's father comes charging down the stairs. He's got his gun in hand and he's like, what's going on? And they say, there's someone out in our property. Their dad charges out the front door. The front door is not on the same wall as the living room. It's on the side of the house. So once he goes outside, he's going to need to turn to the right to look out in the direction they were describing. He bombs outside, he stays on the porch, and he starts yelling at whoever's out there that if you come over here, I'm going to shoot you, get the F away from here. And then there's silence. And the boys are waiting, they're looking around, they're checking the window. They don't see anything. The dad comes back inside, he shut and locks the door, and he tells Evan, keep an eye out. If you see him again, you let me know. Evan would reflect on this experience later on and say, you know, we really should have called 911 at that point. But as a kid, I just understood that that's the way my family did business. We kind of took care of ourselves. And so even though there is a threat of some stranger who's running at our property, we were not going to call the cops. And so his dad effectively was telling him to be a lookout. And so Evan and his cousin, they go back into the living room and they kind of go up to the window. They're a little bit apprehensive and they're looking out. And after 5-10 minutes of looking out the window and not seeing anything, they're thinking to themselves, you know, Evan's dad's a pretty intimidating guy. And he was just out there screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. So they probably got the message and they're probably gone. And so the boys got back into their couches, and it took them a while, but they did ultimately fall asleep. The next morning when the boys got up, the first thing they wanted to do was go out there and see if they could find footprints from this person to kind of confirm it really was a person, because part of them thought, you know, maybe we didn't see that. Maybe that was our imaginations. They don't know. And so they start by going out the front door, so not on the same wall as the living room. They go out the front door, they turn and they walk down into the trees, and they're looking around and they find some footprints. So they're confirming to themselves, okay, there was someone out here. It wasn't us. This is not our footprints. We found them. So they start following the footprints back towards the property, and they realize at some point there are two distinct sets of footprints. There were two people out here. And even worse is they followed them all the way up to the house. And there were two different circles of footprints that stopped right underneath the living room window along the two flanks of the window where the sheet was not covering. Which means over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were up at that window looking out, there's a good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up against the side of the house. And they would not have seen them because of the angle out of the living room window. It was steep because of the stilts it was on. And so anybody that was tucked up along the side, they'd be in a blind spot. And then for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into bed and were sleeping, there were two strangers who were right up against those windows, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father found these footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from, but unfortunately the snow cover wasn't complete, and at some point they lost the tracks and they never figured out who those two people were. Evan would say, following this event, his cousin refused to ever come back over his house for a sleepover. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated, there's lots of lights and cameras, so anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, you know, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside, and the crickets and the passing by of cars, when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body, he could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this is probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic, just total silence. And then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right, in that corner was this big armoire, and then moving left from the armoire as he scanned the room, you'd come to the door, which is on the opposite side of where his bed was, and then if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. but because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. And so with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he has not looked at yet. And he sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner is this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, there's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here? And he managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. And before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of view. And then Nathan's head fell back, and now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore, and he's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire, he sees the door, he can't see that table and chair, and then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. And he's laying there terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound, and he's telling himself this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And he's laying there, and this woman, she stands up and she leans out over his bed, and she looks at him, and her face is pale and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. And then she begins to slowly crawl on top of him, and Nathan's sitting here looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't. Then he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. And then he finally manages to let out a scream, and then suddenly he's awake. The woman's gone. And he sits up and he's looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. And his mom comes running in the room, and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." And he said, "Oh, no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." And his mom's like, "Okay, all right, you need anything?" And he's like, "Nope." So she comes over, she gives him a hug and a kiss. She goes back to bed, and he would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with a Disney movie on and with lights on. And there was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and he just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, big outdoor barbecue, all of his family's there, and at some point his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. And so for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic. And so she would believe him. If he's telling her this is what happened, she would believe that that's what he saw. And so he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in and she goes, wait a minute. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room and then I saw this woman and she was like standing on me. I thought I was gonna die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. And at the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their only sleep paralysis experience in the same room in roughly the same timeline and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that, but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird, and they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had, and his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it, and so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen. And then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall is the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was gonna stay. And then to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, so the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door. And from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So that's the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights are off, it's just the TV on, and at some point, he dozes off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom at her apartment. And he begins to panic because the last time he felt this way, a strange veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so immediately, he's trying to move his body, he can't. And so using his eyes, he starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. And so he looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see. There's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room. He sees the TV, it's still on. He keeps scanning and he sees the door and it's open. And then he scans and he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. And so initially he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway. And he's thinking to himself, please do not come walking through that door. And so he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of the sleep paralysis, when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so he averts his gaze to the TV, and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It does not look like a TV show. It looks like CCTV camera footage, like it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs. And he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. And she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room. The hallway is dark. And he's left paralyzed, knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house. And it sounds like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor, and she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's gonna come flying up those stairs and she's gonna come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one step, two-step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance, stop this paralysis, wake up, wake up. And then he sees her head emerge, and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him, and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up. Except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment, when he sat up and he had the sensation of relief. You've woken up. You were asleep before, now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up.
He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled, she's half asleep, and she's like, was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had, but like he can't process what's happening. And he just says, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. At this point, it's survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down. They're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then a couple months after that, I talked to my sister and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that room and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we've basically had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who's running around the house, and you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She says to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment way long time ago, but I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, showed up in the room and she stood on me, and it scared the heck out of me, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought it was sleep paralysis. And so Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could they, all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan, he was in the bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her bedroom. And she didn't have any pets, so who could it be? Nathan says he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last experience Nathan had, and they're just hoping it stays that way.